At first he was just my younger brother. Then he became my roommate. And when I decided to live on my own, he became a danger that I had to run away from. My name is Lena, I'm 24, and when my younger brother Brandon asked if he could live with me after graduation, I didn't hesitate for a second. I thought I was helping him start a new life in the city, a fresh chapter with opportunity, structure, and support. He had always looked up to me in that quiet, protective way little brothers sometimes do, and even though we were only 4 years apart, I had spent most of our lives feeling more like a second parent than a sibling, especially after our dad left and our mom started working 2 jobs just to stay afloat. Brandon had just turned 20, full of that restless post-high school energy, and while he wasn't exactly directionless, he was definitely drifting, talking about trying out a few community college classes, picking up part-time work, maybe figuring things out in a bigger place. I had a steady job, a small but clean 1-bedroom apartment, and the kind of structure he seemed to need, so I told him he could sleep on the pull-out couch, no rent until he got on his feet. I genuinely believed it would be good for both of us, a chance to reconnect and help him transition into adulthood. What I didn't realize then was that letting him in would unravel my life in ways I never saw coming. We grew up in the aftermath of a messy, painful divorce that left more cracks than closure, with our father disappearing so completely from our lives that sometimes I wondered if we had imagined him altogether, while our mother worked herself to exhaustion just to keep a roof over our heads and dinner on the table. From the time Brandon was still small enough to need help tying his shoes, I stepped into a role that no one officially gave me but that I felt obligated to fill. Cooking simple meals when mom worked late, checking his homework, walking him to school, sitting beside him when he cried because he didn't understand why dad never called. Over time, I stopped being just his big sister and started to feel more like a second parent, someone who carried his fears, soothed his tantrums, and celebrated his small victories like they were my own. It was never a burden, not back then. I loved him and I believed he needed me, and in a way I think I needed him too. Someone to protect, someone to pour all my energy into when the world felt unstable. That bond between us ran deep, shaped by shared survival and quiet understanding, and when he asked to live with me years later, that part of me, the protector, the caretaker, couldn't say no. I left for college in another state as soon as I could, not out of resentment but out of necessity, chasing a sense of independence and possibility that had always felt just out of reach in our small hometown. I worked hard, studied harder, and after graduation I managed to find a decent job in the city, a place that felt alive, full of momentum and opportunity, the kind of environment where I could finally breathe and build something of my own. The apartment was small but mine, the job demanding but fulfilling, and slowly I began to carve out a life that felt stable in a way our childhood never had. A few years later, Brandon reached out and asked if he could come live with me. He said he needed a fresh start, wanted to try something new, get out of the dead-end routines that were already starting to trap him. The way he said it, half hopeful, half defeated, hit something deep inside me, and without even thinking twice I told him yes. It felt natural, like continuing a role I had never really let go of, and I believed with everything in me that this time I was doing something good. I thought bringing him into my world would help him move forward, but I didn't realize how quickly he would start pulling me backward. We found a small but comfortable 2-room apartment on the quieter side of the city, a place that felt like a good compromise between affordability and independence, and in the beginning, everything felt easy. Brandon helped with groceries, unpacked boxes, and even offered to cook a few nights a week, and for a while it felt like the kind of sibling companionship we had never fully gotten to experience growing up. But before long, subtle things started to shift in ways that made me pause. Brandon became overly interested in the details of my personal life, constantly asking about my friends, wanting to know who I was texting or where I was going after work, and showing an almost obsessive curiosity about any man I mentioned, even in passing. If I said I was grabbing dinner with someone, he'd press for details, how long I'd be gone, who was picking me up, when I'd be back, and it stopped sounding like concern and started to feel like surveillance. He wasn't aggressive or obvious about it at first, it was more like a steady stream of questions wrapped in casual tone, but underneath it all, I could feel the pressure of something that didn't belong between siblings. It was subtle, but it was growing, and I couldn't ignore how tightly he was beginning to monitor my life. I tried to ignore the way Brandon was starting to watch me more closely, telling myself that it was just part of the adjustment. He was in a new city, out of his comfort zone, and maybe he just didn't know how to settle into his own life yet. I chalked up his questions and strange silences to the discomfort of transition, the loneliness of starting over. But everything changed the moment I started dating a guy named Jake. It wasn't even serious at first, just a few casual dinners, a movie, a couple of late-night walks. But the moment Brandon heard his name more than once, something in him snapped. One night, when I mentioned that Jake might come over for a bit, Brandon completely lost it. He threw a tantrum, not like an angry roommate or even an annoyed sibling, but like someone who had been personally betrayed. He raised his voice, accused me of being selfish, said I was prioritizing strangers over family, and went off about how I was always leaving him alone and treating him like a burden. The intensity of his reaction stunned me. I stood there speechless, realizing this wasn't about awkwardness or stress anymore. This was something deeper, something unsettling, and I didn't know how to handle the way he looked at me, like I owed him something I couldn't quite name. Brandon told me without hesitation or any attempt at compromise that I was not allowed to bring Jake home anymore, saying flatly, "It's my house too," as if that single sentence gave him the right to dictate my personal life within the walls I had invited him into. His tone wasn't just firm, it was possessive, sharp, with a kind of entitlement I had never expected to hear from him, and it made something in my stomach twist. I pushed back, tried to explain that I had every right to see who I wanted, to have guests over, to live like an adult in my own space, but the conversation quickly turned into a fight. He raised his voice again, deflecting every point I made, twisting my words, telling me I was picking some guy over family, accusing me of disrespecting him after everything he gave up to live here, as if I hadn't been the one supporting him every step of the way. Standing in the middle of our shared apartment, listening to him rant and sulk like a wounded child, I realized that something about this entire dynamic was deeply off. This wasn't normal sibling tension or growing pains, it was control. And the longer I stayed silent, the more it felt like I was shrinking inside my own home. Over time, Brandon's grip on my life only tightened, becoming more invasive in ways that were hard to excuse or explain away. He began tracking where I went with unnerving consistency, texting constantly if I didn't respond quickly, asking for photos to prove where I was or who I was with, and each time I pushed back, he'd claim it was just because he worried or wanted to make sure I was safe. But that kind of concern doesn't feel like surveillance unless it comes from a place that isn't love. It comes from control. Then one night, I came home from work and noticed something strange. A few of my things, nothing huge, just personal items like a bracelet, a bottle of perfume, and a book I'd been reading, were missing from my room. At first, I thought maybe I'd misplaced them until I asked Brandon, and he gave me a weirdly casual answer saying, "Oh, some of my friends were over, they probably took it by accident." He didn't even sound bothered, like the idea of people rifling through my belongings was no big deal. But I knew, in the quiet certainty that comes when instinct refuses to be silenced, that it hadn't been his friends, it had been him. Something in the way he said it, so dismissive, so unconcerned, made my skin crawl. He was no longer just overstepping boundaries. He was erasing them. Then, without any warning or conversation, Brandon brought home a girl named Macy one evening, introducing her with an offhand tone like it was no big deal, as if it were perfectly normal to suddenly have someone new living in our space without so much as a heads up. At first I was just surprised, unsure of what her presence really meant, but the longer she stayed, the more unsettled I became, not because of her but because of him. The way he looked at her was odd, intense but distant, like she was both a placeholder and an audience, someone he wanted near but not necessarily for her sake. But what really made my skin crawl was the way he looked at me when she was around. It wasn't just different, it was calculating, watching me too closely, like he was trying to provoke a reaction, waiting to see how I'd respond to this sudden change. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, something cold and hard to name, and it filled the room with an unspoken tension that Macy, sweet and clearly oblivious, didn't seem to notice. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself at the time, but deep in my gut, I felt it. Something about the way he was arranging this dynamic, how he moved between us, wasn't right. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. One day, as we stood in the kitchen pretending everything was fine, Macy leaned in just slightly, her voice barely above a whisper, and said, "Is he always this intrusive?" The words hit me like a quiet shock, not because I didn't already know the answer, but because for the first time, someone else saw it too. Someone who hadn't lived our history, who had no reason to be biased or overly sensitive, someone new enough to still question what I had long since tried to normalize. I turned to look at her, and in her expression I saw something that made my chest tighten. Not fear exactly, but discomfort, confusion, like she was trying to make sense of a feeling she didn't have the language for yet. I knew that feeling well. It was the same one I had tried to push down for months, the same one I had smothered with excuses and rationalizations. And in that moment, I realized she was feeling it too. The way he hovered, the way he watched, the way every question he asked sounded like it came from a place of possession rather than concern. She didn't say more and I didn't push her, but her words stayed with me long after she left the room. It was no longer just my instinct whispering that something was wrong. It was someone else's too. I decided I couldn't keep living like that, constantly walking on eggshells in my own home, second-guessing every decision, every conversation, every time I smiled at someone who wasn't him, and so I started looking for a new apartment. Claire, a friend I had met through work and quickly grown close to, offered to help, and together we quietly searched listings, toured places, and whispered plans in coffee shops far from the apartment. I kept everything a secret, not because I wanted to lie, but because I knew the truth would trigger something in Brandon that I wasn't ready to face, not until I had somewhere else to go. When I finally decided to tell him, I waited until I was absolutely certain. Lease signed, boxes already packed in my mind, and I sat him down, trying to keep my voice steady as I told him I would be moving out soon. At first, he was completely silent, staring at me with a blankness that felt more dangerous than yelling. And then, like a dam cracking under pressure, he broke down, not in sadness but in something darker. His voice rose, his hands shook, and he began accusing me of betrayal, of abandonment, of choosing strangers over my own blood. It was the kind of breakdown that wasn't about grief, it was about losing control. In that moment, I saw how much of his identity had been tied to keeping me under his thumb, and how terrifying it must have felt to him that I was finally slipping out of his reach. But I didn't flinch. Not this time. His rage was immediate and uncontrollable, like something had finally snapped inside him, and all the tension that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface exploded into something I hadn't fully believed he was capable of until that moment. The first thing he did was push Macy out of the apartment, not just asking her to leave, but physically shoving her toward the door with such force and fury that she stumbled and nearly fell, too stunned to say anything before disappearing down the hallway. And then he turned on me full force, unleashing a storm of screaming, pacing, accusations, and name-calling that made the walls of our home feel like they were closing in around me. He called me a whore, a traitor, said I was ungrateful and disgusting, throwing out every insult he could find like weapons, each one more personal than the last. I stood still for as long as I could, tears burning in my eyes but refusing to fall, until I finally turned and began packing my things, shaking as I shoved clothes into a bag, trying to ignore the way he kept yelling behind me. I thought I might make it out before he touched me, thought maybe he'd scream himself hoarse and let me go, but as I reached the door, my hand on the knob, he caught up with me and without hesitation hit me in the face. It was so sudden that I didn't even feel pain right away, just a white-hot flash of disbelief, the shock of betrayal landing harder than the strike itself. I stumbled back, dazed, tasting blood in my mouth, and in that moment, everything became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just control. It was violence. And I had to get out before it became something even worse. I fell to the floor, the impact of the hit disorienting me more than I could have imagined, and for a moment I couldn't even move, just lay there stunned, blinking up at the ceiling as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Brandon didn't stop to help, didn't say anything, didn't even look at me. Instead, he stepped over my body like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture in his way and walked out of the apartment without a word, slamming the door behind him. I don't know how long I lay there before my body remembered what it needed to do, but eventually I stood, my cheek throbbing and my legs shaking, and I grabbed my bag, already packed, thank God, and stumbled out the door. In a state of numb shock, I took the train to Claire's apartment, the ride a blur of fluorescent lights and strangers' faces I couldn't process. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, bruised and trembling, she didn't ask any questions, didn't demand an explanation. She just pulled me into her arms and said, "You're safe now." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. I took photos of my bruises as soon as I could, documenting the swelling on my face, the red marks on my arm, the faint outline of where I had hit the floor, and I wrote down every detail I could remember while it was still fresh. The words he yelled, the way he looked at me the moment his fist made contact. I didn't let myself second guess it this time, didn't fall into the familiar trap of minimizing or justifying what had happened, because I knew, deep in my bones, that this wasn't just a fight between siblings or a misunderstanding. This was abuse, and I wasn't going to carry it in silence. With Claire by my side, I walked into the police station, hands trembling but heart resolute, and told the officer at the desk that I needed to report an assault. As I sat in that quiet, fluorescent-lit room, telling a stranger everything I had been too afraid to say out loud for months, I braced myself for disbelief or dismissal. But instead, I heard something I had never expected to hear: "You have the right to be safe." Those words, simple and clear, cut through every layer of guilt and shame I had wrapped around myself, and for the first time in my life I felt like someone saw me, not just as a sister or a caretaker or a victim, but as a human being who deserved protection. Later, when I finally spoke to Macy again, the pieces of the puzzle I hadn't been able to put together on my own began to fall into place with chilling clarity. She told me in a quiet, hesitant voice that Brandon had been acting strangely almost from the beginning, doing things that made her uncomfortable but that she couldn't quite explain at the time. He had asked her, repeatedly, to wear clothes that looked almost exactly like mine, even giving her one of my old sweaters and telling her it looked better on her, and she hadn't thought much of it until he began insisting that she style her hair the way I did, that she watched the same shows I liked, that she listened to the exact playlists I used to put on during weekends at home. At first, she'd brushed it off as quirky or obsessive, but as the days went on and his behavior grew more controlling, she started to feel like she wasn't being seen as herself anymore, like she was being turned into someone else, someone he couldn't quite let go of. When I asked her directly if she had felt unsafe, she didn't hesitate. She said yes. She had been scared. Not of an outburst, but of how easily he crossed lines, how intensely he watched her, how it always felt like he was chasing something else through her. And in that moment, everything inside me froze, because I knew exactly who he had been chasing. I filed the application with a calm, quiet determination, no longer driven by fear but by the clear knowledge that protecting myself was not only justified, it was necessary. The moment the paperwork was submitted, it felt like a weight I had been carrying for years finally began to lift. What I didn't expect was the call from my father, who had been a ghost for most of my life, distant and uninvolved, someone I had long stopped counting on. But somehow word reached him, and for the first time in years he took my side without hesitation. He told me he believed me, that he was sorry for the silence, and then, without asking for thanks, he hired a lawyer to help me see this through. I don't know how it will end, what twists might still be ahead in this process, or how long it will take to truly feel safe again, but what I do know is that I finally feel free. Not because Brandon is gone, but because the hold he had over me, masked as family, guilt, loyalty, has been broken. I see it now for what it was: manipulation dressed in familiar language, control disguised as care. And I will never let that happen again. I have learned that love doesn't demand silence, and family should never hurt you and call it home.